Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the SEDCOR Monthly Business Forum. Thank you once again for logging in with us and joining us. It's always exciting to hear from Tim Dewey. He's an old SEDCOR friend and familiar face, to teach us, give us some ideas as to what's happening in the economy, both right now and what's on the horizon for us. So we're looking forward to that conversation. A little different this time. We are featuring some of our SEDCOR members, board members, partners in the community, just as to give Tim some faces so he's not speaking into a void here. So I'd like to thank some of our SEDCOR friends for agreeing to be on camera while Tim is presenting today. So don't worry, there's not 15 panelists. We are here to hear Tim, but thankful we have a really good group of people here to watch along with us. Before we get started, just a couple of announcements. A reminder that our upcoming events are all online on our website. You can check that our events page. It's all updated for the events through 2021. And also follow us on social media. We always appreciate you checking in on LinkedIn or Facebook with us. We've got a couple other events coming up in the near term. We're partners with the Willamette Workforce Partnership, Chemeketa Community College, and the Oregon Manufacturing Extension Partnership on a kind of an organization called the Business and Industry Resource Alliance. And we're holding a workforce challenge discussion, basically talking about some of the challenges that we're hearing about in the community and what some businesses are doing to try to help find workers or work around those challenges. And that's going to be held on May 25th at 2 p.m. That link will go out in our post webinar mailing that goes out today. And also that will be featured on our website and future mailings. As well, our next business webinar will be on June 9th at noon. The topic will be on building a stronger workforce with the Willamette Promise, featuring speakers from the Willamette ESD. And registration is now open on our website for that. A lot of people have been missing our golf tournament, and we're happy to say that that is back on the calendar for this year. At this point, we are scheduled for September 10th at Illahee once again, and we're excited to kind of get back on the greens and see all of our hole sponsors and see all the golfers come out. We'll be getting more information out to our sponsors and other folks soon. I know right now we are in the mode of trying to come up with a theme. So if anybody has some really great theme ideas, we're kind of famous for those. Please send us your ideas either through the chat feature or follow us up with us or with Jenny just to, if you've got some great ideas of how we can provide a theme for our tournament and the holes that we always, people always seem to enjoy. We're pretty well set for next year's tournament because it's a 40-year anniversary. So that gives us quite a bit of opportunity to celebrate 40 years. But for this year, we could use some help and some ideas. We will have a Q&A at the end of the presentation with Tim today. So please use that feature on Zoom if you have questions. And sometimes folks do put it in the chat feature, and we try to keep track, but they do get lost in there sometimes. Also, I'd like to thank the University of Oregon for their continued support in providing Tim the opportunity to come and talk to us on a pretty regular basis. So thanks to U of O for their support and for helping us bring Tim to you today. And please let me take the time now to introduce our featured speaker, Tim Dewey. Oh, I just found out our chat feature is missing on this one. So sorry about that. I don't know if it was just my screen. So if you do have ideas for the golf tournament or other suggestions for us, please just get those to us via email or through other means. But thank you for that. Back to Tim. Professor Dewey received his BA in economics in 1991 from the University of Puget Sound and his MS and PhD in economics in 1998 from the University of Oregon. Following graduate school, Tim worked in Washington, D.C. for the U.S. Department of Treasury as an economist in the International Affairs Division, and later with the G7 Group, a political and economic consultancy for clients in the financial industry. Tim returned to the University of Oregon in 2002. He's the senior director of the Oregon Economic Forum and the author of the University of Oregon Statewide Economic Indicators, Regional Economic Indicators, and the Central Oregon Business Index. Tim is published in the Journal of Economics and Business and is currently a member of the Oregon Governor's Council on Economic Advisors and the State Debt Policy Advisory Commission. Tim is a prominent commentator on the Federal Reserve. MarketWatch described his blog as influential. The Huffington Post identified him as one of the top 26 economists to follow on Twitter, and he is listed on Street Eye as one of the top 100 people to follow to discover finance news on Twitter. Major national and international news outlets frequently quote him, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Financial Times, and the Wall Street Journal. We also quote him quite a bit around here at SEDCOR, so even more important than the Wall Street Journal. He also writes a regular column for Bloomberg Opinion. So we are thrilled once again to have Tim here with us and look forward to hearing his spin on what's happening in the economy and where we're going from here. So welcome, Tim. Thank you.
All right. So thanks for that introduction. It's nice to see everyone. Appreciate seeing some faces out there. I'm going to share my screen here. So okay, hold on. I accidentally hit the advanced sharing option. I haven't taught all terms, so who knows what's going on. All right. Share. Okay. So okay, hold on one second. So I totally messed this up, right? Because I click here to make changes. Hold on. So it's a funny story.
A funny story we're going to have to be waiting on for a little bit.
Okay, let's see if, yeah, no, I totally messed this up, right? Because share, install.
I think we're getting there, Tim.
I know. Can you believe I said earlier too?
I did knock wood for you when you said that it was all set up, but
I know you said that. Okay, so here's the funny story. This is why this did not work smoothly. I did something you're not supposed to do. And what I did was pour a cup of coffee into my last MacBook, right? And so that was about 2 weeks ago. And I will tell you that that's not something you want to do. Because that will, in fact, kill your computer. So I'm working with a brand new computer, and some things were not set up, including, obviously, this particular element. So my bad. Anyway, that aside, talk for today, the pandemic recovery, key themes for 2021. We're going to start off with some Oregon overview, and then I'm going to get into some of the big macro themes that are really weighing or pressing down on the economy right now. So big macro story for Oregon is things are getting better. So the University of Oregon Index of Economic Indicators, I think KeyBank, has been moving up and in the right direction. And here, I'll also do this from current slide there. And I think that's clearly a good indication of which way we're going. So we're going to sort of talk about some of the underlying data, but this has been a good measure of really capturing when the economy has turned. It's a little bit different than we've seen in the past, because if you notice, the recession here was probably very short-lived. A lot of my slides still have a very long recession period. They're based on, in most cases, they're based on the National Bureau of Economic Research Business Cycle Dating Committee. And they declared that the recession started in March of last year and have not declared an end to the recession. Now, most likely the recession itself, the technical part of the recession was only March and April, the 2 months where economic activity was really falling. Since then, actually, economic activity has been rising and has gotten quite a bit of an upswing in the first quarter of this year, and is on quite a bit of an upswing in the second quarter of this year as well. So we're way out of the recession, and we're clearly into the recovery stage. And the themes really are revolving around, what's the economy look like? What are the good parts of the recovery? What are the challenging parts? I don't say bad anymore. I say challenging. It sounds better. Most Oregon indicators have been moving in the right direction. Initial jobless claims obviously spiked in the early part of the downturn. They've come down quite a bit. Firms just don't need to lay off workers anymore. And so that's been a typical business cycle indicator. Employment services payrolls, this is mostly temporary help employees. You see that has been on the upswing. It's not really caught up to pre-recession, pre-pandemic trends yet, but it's moving in the right direction. Generally a forward-looking indicator. Firms typically hire temporary workers first and then convert them to permanent workers later. An interesting one we'll talk about is Oregon residential building permits. And building permits have really held fairly strong during this downturn. And you can see this is very much different than what we did in the last recession, right? Last recession was really a housing driven dynamic that then spilled into the financial markets and had a very lasting impact on the economy. This time, not so much. Housing market's been booming. We're going to talk about some reasons for why that's the case as we get sort of deeper into the themes affecting the US economy. Hours worked in manufacturing is starting to come back. This series has been depressed for unknown reasons. We haven't been able to track down exactly why it was depressed going into the recession. It seems to be some sector specific factors, particularly around food manufacturing. But that said, it's moving in the right direction. I just don't know where this series is going to level out. Indicators, sort of general, some other Oregon indicators. This one I like, the weight distance tax. So this is a measure of trucking activity. And it's been very steady going into this, throughout this downturn, steady increase, and has really picked up in recent weeks, recent months. This is consistent really with the kind of downturn we've seen, which is dominated by a shift really from services spending to goods spending. Because goods spending has stayed strong, we've actually had a lot of movement of goods through the economy. This has been helped the last couple of months, certainly because there's a big jump up in demands for goods, and also probably some forestry activity sneaking in there too. We know that the housing markets are hot, lumber prices are high, and that's driving a lot of activity. A couple other things we can see: Oregon payrolls, jobs are starting to come back. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Oregon labor force has been growing. I don't know that this is a good number. We think that there's a lot of problems with actually some of the data measurements. You can see how it's been really jerky during this period of time. So I'm not sure labor force has been growing as aggressively as this number would suggest. Unemployment, though, has been falling, as we would expect as we get deeper into the recovery here. So those are some broad trends that we're seeing right now in the Oregon economy, cyclical trends. How does this compare really to sort of previous recoveries? Well, I pulled a couple of these charts from the state Oregon Employment Department and the Oregon Office of Economic Analysis. Josh Lehner, you may have had him speak. He's a great speaker, and I highly recommend him. Partly because then you have somebody else to do these all the time throughout the state. Comparison to past recessions. When we went into this downturn, this was clearly the most severe and rapid downturn we've seen in essentially U.S. economic history. Nothing like this has ever happened, where you just literally shut down large portions of the economy overnight. And clearly jobs in the economy shrank. And the big question was, how rapid is the recovery going to be? Is it going to be long and drawn out like this 2007 trend, or is it going to be a much more rapid recovery? The evidence that we have now suggests a much more rapid recovery from this downturn. Within 3 years, the Oregon Office of Economic Analysis expects to have reclaim the pre-pandemic peak in jobs. So that would be very rapid. We're going to talk about what could slow this down going forward. Right? But you can see right now, we've got a fairly rapid recovery, certainly nothing like we've seen in these past cycles. And we'll talk about, again, why this cycle is very different and why we should be looking out for some significant behavior this year. Another factor, another interesting story in how this has affected Oregon is the difference between rural Oregon and non-rural Oregon, right? The more urban you were, on average, the more you were impacted by this downturn. So if you were out, say, in the far eastern part of the state, the Columbia, up the Columbia River, you might have had very small job losses relative to the pre-pandemic peak. Right? Whereas obviously, if you're in the Portland area or Eugene area, you had more severe losses. So what's going on here is this was a downturn that really had its hardest impact on the agglomerated parts of our economy, particularly those parts of the economy that were dealing with a large concentration of office workers, right? So Portland here is going to take the obvious hit because Portland's economy and particularly downtown ecosystem is dependent upon, like all other major metro areas, a bunch of people flooding into the city during the day, right? Doing their thing, having lunch, staying for dinner, maybe a couple drinks afterwards, and then wandering back out to their homes, right? That entire ecosystem was disrupted by the pandemic. Clearly, people don't come downtown, then there's nobody there to eat at restaurants, do retail shopping, etc. So that's why these larger areas took a hit. Lane County also took an extra hit. And if you had a university in your town, or that was a dominant area, that also gave you an extra weight down. So Lane County, Corvallis, right? Part of that's just because we don't have students spending the economy. Another part of that's because we're not hiring as many students, right? So those are definitely transitory impacts. I expect next year, for example, OSU and the University of Oregon to have freshman classes that are probably at or near records, right? Because I shouldn't say this too loud, but anyone with common sense probably took last year off, right? and didn't go to school. But if you send your kid to school, I understand. And probably would have delayed the college experience for a year until they could have the full freshman college experience, right? And so I would expect the universities across the nation are really flooded with applicants into this year. So that's a real difference in this urban versus rural compared to past recessions, which typically hit rural areas harder. Now, I don't know how long it takes for the Portland area in particular to come back together. So a lot of that depends upon how much work from home changes our behavior and how persistent that is. So the bigger portion of our populations the bigger portions of our populations that don't return to the office, obviously the more that those traditional urban ecosystems are going to have to be rebuilt or changed to address that. And you hear stories across the board of how firms are handling this. Some firms are basically, they're no longer, particularly in tech, they're saying we're going to avoid having sort of a major agglomeration of workers in a particular city. We're going to let our workforce spread out, either work from home or more satellite offices, right? Some firms are basically going to go all work from home. Other firms are saying, well, we're going to go, 3 days a week our employees come in, or 2 days a week our employees come in, right? I don't know if it'll ever be back to everybody is work at the office. I don't think so. I think that the dynamic and the expectations have shifted dramatically. A lot of firms find themselves more productive when their workers aren't all bunched together, maybe because their workers aren't spending as much time chatting, right, with each other. Workers don't like doing the commute don't like doing the commute. So they're happier being at home, right? So that can change patterns of activity. a bigger city that had a more entrenched ecosystem, right, and economic ecosystem dependent upon that, it's going to have a harder time adjusting than, say, maybe Salem or Eugene, which were just sort of edging into that ecosystem, right, on a bigger basis. So, and that's kind of a relative plus, south of the valley relative to the far north of the valley. You also might see some of those urban amenities spread out, right? So instead of having your famous restaurant in downtown Portland or downtown Seattle, maybe you have to find a hub, right? A walkable, or nearly walkable hub outside that main central area. So we can see a lot of change underneath the surface as this recovery continues. I don't want to go too much in Portland. Portland's got some other problems that they have to work through. Anyway, another big factor, another big difference in this recovery has been, or this downturn has been, it has had a much more significant impact on low income workers than higher income workers. This is due to the nature of the downturn. It was heavily concentrated in leisure and hospitality industries, which have a higher proportion of low income workers. So that's what's going on there. Those jobs will start to come back and are already starting to come back over the next year or 2 years as the economy reopens. So we'll see some of this even out. This surprise, by the way, that it was so concentrated among low-income workers is one reason the Oregon state budget is not as bad as we expected. We would have expected very severe impacts on state and local budgets as a result of the pandemic. The concentration of workers at the lower end of this system scale, which aren't paying as many taxes, really changed our expectations there. So the state's been much better off than we anticipated. Oregon, pretty much following national trends, right? Employment losses, maybe a little bit more. Unemployment rate, pretty much the same as the rest of the nation. Wages and salaries, maybe a little bit behind, but not too far behind, right? So this cycle has hit Oregon about average, which has been good news. Some of that's probably due to less damage to the manufacturing sector than maybe would have happened during a normal cycle, because Oregon's a little bit heavy in manufacturing relative to the rest of the country. So I think, overall, Oregon has weathered this fairly well and consistent with what we've seen, I think, in other parts of the country. And so, I'm optimistic that we'll still see sort of a strong recovery because I don't think that we're significantly out of whack with anything else going on in the national economy. So, but what are those things going on in the national economy, and how are those going to filter through to Oregon? And this is the part of the presentation that I've been talking about a lot lately, and that's we're not fighting the last battle in the sense that this is a completely different type of economic cycle than we're all used to. And these are things that I've learned over the past year. I started to see this last fall, that this wasn't going to be the same. And now I've kind of really developed a much better, I think, line of thinking on why this isn't the same. And I want to go through that. I don't think I've gone through that with this group. Boy, I hope not. It'd be embarrassing. What are those things? Well, I think the first one we should talk about is that this is primarily a supply side shock. Our experience in the last, 30 years is that most of the shocks that hit the economy are fairly concentrated in the demand side of the economy. They're usually negative demand side shocks, which means that something happens such that we don't have the willingness or capacity to spend as much overall. That really wasn't the big factor this time. The biggest factor this time was something happened that prevented us from buying. It wasn't our willingness to buy. It's that we couldn't go to large parts of the economy and actively use those parts of the economy, right? So it was a large supply shock. It's like a snowstorm, right? Except a real big snowstorm. And that's not what that's not what the last recession was. The last recession was the opposite. It was a very large demand shock and a very persistent demand shock. This was a very large supply shock and not a very persistent one either. As soon as the economy started to reopen, the economy started taking off and trying to resume to normal. So what are some examples of that? Well, one I wanted to talk about because it just came out last week and I think is important and speaks, I think, to the environment that a lot of small firms are dealing with is there's an enormous amount of demand for jobs right now, right? Labor demand is very high. This is from a report called the Job Openings and Labor Turnover Survey. It's done by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It's national numbers. But you can see what's happened here is that jobs openings are well above pre-pandemic job openings, both in levels and rates, percentage of population, right? So compare this to what happened in the last downturn, right? The last downturn, a big drop in job openings, right? And then a very slow recovery back to pre-pandemic, pre-recession levels, right? This was a smaller drop in job openings and a very rapid recovery to above pre-pandemic levels. So major demand for jobs throughout the US economy right now, because this was really not about a persistent sort of demand shock, but this was things were shut down. We started to reopen them. Once we reopened them, we needed a bunch of workers again. Okay? Now, this is a little technical, but it's fun. This is called the beverage curve, and it's a relationship between unemployment here and job openings, right? So typically the relationship is this kind of relationship. As job openings go up, down, that's consistent with unemployment going up, right? And you could see in the last recession, right, we actually had a slow return back to our initial relationship, right? We think that the slow return is really more about demand side factors, as the firms really weren't hiring all that aggressively, right? You can see what's been going on now is that, you know, the behavior of firms is that they've got a lot of jobs open relative to the number of unemployed out there, right? It's shifted, at least temporarily, far to the right, right? That's something that typically signifies there's a lot of frictions in job markets. There's something preventing workers and employers from matching well, right? Leading this very tight labor market situation, even though you have high measures of unemployment or fairly high unemployment, right? So that's sort of one key thing that says, wait a second, is it that the demand side of the economy has really now swamped the supply side of the economy, at least in the near term, that's creating all these weird dynamics that we're kind of experiencing right now in the jobs market. One thing I like to show too is that, let me do this a little bit way. Part of this, I think, is due to the generous unemployment benefits that we've offered, right? So this is the unemployment rate for new job entrants, re-entrants, job leavers, people who left their job, and people who've completed temporary jobs, right? These are workers that are not able to collect unemployment, right? You can see that the unemployment rate for this category of worker is only slightly elevated, right? It's because there's plenty of jobs, right? If you left your job and need a job, you can probably find one. You probably didn't leave your job without having a job, right? If you re-enter the market, job market, or a new entrant, you probably can get a job, right? So the job labor market, the unemployment rate is very low. And again, compare that to the last recession, right? The last recession, unemployment for this group of workers was very high, right? Relative to the pre-pandemic levels, right? And stayed high, right? Right? So that's telling me that most of our unemployment is really around workers that are eligible for unemployment insurance, right? So I think that there's a big chunk of the population that really is sort of less willing to accept jobs, have less aggressive search efforts because of the generous unemployment insurance. Now, this is a hotly debated topic. Nobody wants to like acknowledge this issue might be a factor because it appears that you're sort of being cruel to workers. This is not me taking a moral stance on this. This is just simply, as I see the world, that this is probably having an effect and impact, and it's kind of a reasonable expectation, I would think too. So, interestingly, the Beveridge curve, the relationship between unemployment rate and job openings for this category of worker is also starting to split away from the norm. So for whatever reason, even for these workers, they're being more picky about what kind of jobs they take. I think that's what's going on. So these are workers that are not related to unemployment insurance, right? There's other factors going on that are depressing the overall labor supply too, because we're only talking about people who are unemployed, which means they're actively looking for a job. Right now, so there's about 3.5, 4 million less workers in the economy right now in the labor force than there were prior to the pandemic, right? So part of those people are probably somehow, work in the unemployment system. Some of them are, two working parents, right? And one of which has to stay home to deal with childcare. That's probably some of it. Other parts of it are possibly related to career changes. So there's other factors that are going on. There's also people that are hesitant to return to the workforce because of COVID, particularly some older workers that have dropped out of the workforce, some of which who probably retired. So there's a lot of other reasons why we could think that in the near term, labor supply is depressed. But we know that this is by the way, the Oregon unemployment replacement rates as a percentage of your base wage. And you can see early in the recession, you were replacing, 150% of wages as much. Now in this program, you're replacing roughly a little bit over 100% of wages. So there's real reason to think that there's some disincentive to be in a program, right? Another place that we can see this was a supply side shock is not just in how quickly labor markets have rebounded once things could open up. It's in patterns of spending. So blue line here is services spending. And you can see that services spending, oh, that's a terrible line. That's what happens in class too, right? Services spending pre-recession, pre-pandemic trend was up here. And we're still way below that trend, right? Whereas goods spending, right, there's our pre-pandemic trend, and we're way above that trend, right? And what's happened is people were locked out of spending on services, so they shifted their spending into goods spending, right? Is the simple story. So that's not a demand side story. It's very much a supply side story, is that I want to buy stuff, I just can't buy all the stuff I used to buy, right? The consumer spending on goods, we can sort of do that as percentage of total consumer spending. And you can see that during the last recession, spending on goods dropped sharply, right? Because if you had a choice, it was easier to stop spending on goods than services, right? Services here would include like elective medical procedures, right? So you want to keep spending on getting your teeth cleaned, right? But you put off spending on goods. That's typically what we see during a recession. Services spending tends to be sticky. You want to keep going to your favorite restaurant. That's more important than some new clothes, right? That's kind of the thought process. Completely opposite this recession, right? Where spending on goods really rose simply because you had no other choice. You have money in your pocket, you got to spend it on something, right? Not always. We'll see that in a second, right? Wrong way. Right? Other sort of thing going on in the background too is there's a huge increase in the stock of savings, right? And this is also a clue that there's plenty of resources out there, both from individuals who retain their jobs and because the fiscal stimulus dumped in the system, right? There's plenty of stimulus out there, spending power out there, but it didn't make its way into spending. It made its way into saving. And right now, the excess stock of savings. So this is what I would call the savings that was above the pre-pandemic trend for saving, right? So that has grown, right? So every month, there's a certain in March, or this additional savings in March. Every month, that stock of savings, that excess savings grows and grows and grows, and is almost $2.5 trillion of excess savings in people's, a lot of it's in people's checking accounts right now. So that's an enormous amount of resources that is just sort of sitting there. We don't know what's going to happen to it. We don't know how much of it's going to be a permanent level shift up in savings, right? Or it's going to make its way back out into spending over the next few years, right? Both have different implications. If it's a level shock up in saving, that has implications for asset prices, right? And elevated asset prices, right? I'd better start moving through these a little bit more quickly, right? That might have been my longest set, right? Household balance sheets are stronger. So household net worth is stronger because we didn't have a housing market collapse. We didn't have a stock market collapse, right? So housing equity has stayed high and is probably even higher now because housing prices have kept going up. This has been across Oregon. Bend, though, has seen some really amazing increases in household wealth because prices there have risen sharply. So, and Salem is going to be somewhere, in this zone too, somewhere around Eugene, a little bit probably above Portland in Eugene zone. Equity prices, we know the stock market recovered very quickly in comparison to the last recovery. So that boosts household wealth. So unlike the last recovery where we had a significant hit to household wealth, right? This time that didn't happen. We had the household balance sheet strengthened. And that means that the spending capacity of the economy is better. We have had unprecedented fiscal policy. And I don't know how much appreciation there is of this particular issue, but this is current transfer payments. So this is payments from the government relative to GDP, right? And what you can see here is this shock is literally just immense, right? It's just off the charts, right? And it goes into the first quarter of this last year, right? Where the transfer payments relative to the size of the economy were nothing like previous efforts at boosting the economy, right? So this is a flood of assets or money coming into the economy at a time when people really couldn't spend it, right? And that's why it got pushed into savings, right? Now I talk about aggregate, there's a lot of different income levels, and so the savings is more concentrated at the upper income levels, but not entirely. It might be the case that a lot of lower or middle income people use the savings to pay off credit cards because we know credit card debt continues to fall. So it's not entirely upper income individuals. We have a new monetary policy framework. And that new monetary policy framework is designed to encourage policymakers to not raise interest rates. I think that's the best way to say it. It used to be that as the unemployment rate got to this magic red line, what the Federal Reserve called the natural rate of unemployment, the Federal Reserve would be interested in raising interest rates. Right? Now, we're nowhere near that point yet. But the story is that the Fed is going to wait until we reach full employment, or their estimate of full employment, until they begin to raise interest rates. That's still a long way off, right? So actually, I'm going to flip here first, right? This is a measure of employment in the economy called the employment to population ratio, right? So it includes not really people who are actively looking for work and therefore maybe unemployed, but also people who have dropped out of the labor force. And what you can see is the employment to population ratio collapsed and is now really just about a little bit above where it was going into at the end of the last recession, right? The Federal Reserve believes that we can get back here without creating an inflationary environment in the economy. Right? So the Federal Reserve believes that they can hold interest rates nearly zero until at least these two lines cross, right? At the current rate of increase in the employment to population ratio, that won't be until 2023, right? So that's the story the Federal Reserve is sticking with. Now, many of you might have noticed that inflation and prices are going up. The consumer price index was released this month. The monthly gain in consumer prices here, annualized it, the monthly gain was 0.9%. So that annualizes, if that's sustained at a whole year rate, it'd be 11.6% inflation, right? That's the highest monthly inflation rate that we've had in core prices since the 1980s, right? Now, that's just 1 month, right? So inflation is an ongoing process, right? We know that this number was boosted by a lot of temporary factors, right? One of which was a surge in used car prices, right? But we also know that there's probably a lot of more persistent factors going on. And we don't know sort of how persistent those factors will be and how large they will versus the transitory element of the inflation, right? What's going on right now is the economy is reopening very fast on the back of a very large fiscal stimulus. On the demand side, the supply, and so you see this in the labor market, right? You see this probably with a weaker jobs report than expected last month, because firms probably can't hire as quickly as they can. Also, we see bottlenecks in production, right? So the reason used car prices are higher is because a computer chip shortage is preventing us from making as many new cars as we would like, right? And that computer chip shortage could go on for years, right? Maybe 2 to 3 years is some estimates that I've seen before you can ramp up a production of computer chips to what the current demand is, right? So that could be a very persistent impact. And we don't know how long it will take for these short-term supply challenges to be relieved. And during that period of time, we're seeing upward pressure on wages and prices, right? And we don't know if it's going to be just for the next 4 months or if that's going to kick off a price process where instead of rising at 2 to 3% price increases, everything's rising at 3 to 4% price increases. It would be a very different macroeconomic environment. I can't give you an answer to that right now. I can tell you that what's happening right now is coming as a surprise to monetary policymakers and probably to all the economists in the administration. No one had expected. They basically designed a stimulus package over the last year to address a Great Depression kind of scenario, right? And that's not the scenario we've ended up with. We've ended up with a very different kind of scenario where the economy is bouncing back much more quickly. And so that conflict between this wave of demand versus the inability to bring firms back as quickly or bring production up to scale as quickly as we'd like is really causing these constraints. And so your small businesses in particular, but big businesses of all sizes are really feeling that in capacity to hire. And it's not just restaurants. It's really, I think, a much more widespread phenomenon. Okay. More supportive demographics. And I've been using this chart for years. You might have seen this. But I think I keep coming back to it because I think it's super important. That this generation, this age group, like 40, 45, 50, that age group is when you hit your prime earning years, right? Your prime earning, your prime spending years, right? The millennial generation is just starting to enter that age group. And you can see that that's a bigger generation, right, than the Gen X generation, right? So this was the opposite situation at the last recession. This is 10 years ago, 15 years ago for the last recession, right? Then it was the boomers giving way to the Gen Xers. And the Gen Xers were a smaller population, right? So you're going into the demographic hole. Now you're climbing the demographic hill, right? Demographic hill is powerful, I think. The biggest, the most similar time I can find is the 1990s. And this one I was able to find 1994, right? Where you're starting to climb this hill of the boomers in their 40, the bulk of the boomer population just became 45 in 1994, right? So, beginning of the 1990s is when the boomers were aging into their 40s. And that was a very strong economic period, right? So that demographic wave, I think, is important to holding together spending capacity going forward. And it's almost certainly what's holding together the housing market, right? Almost certainly what's going on in housing is we're seeing those millennials enter into their peak home buying years, right? And they're scrambling for inventory that doesn't exist anymore. The inventory is depleted for a number of reasons, one of which is, people wanting bigger space because they're working from home. Another is probably older people staying in their homes longer. And that might get more of a boost going forward because the pandemic had its worst impacts on assisted living communities or retirement type of communities. And so that seems like a riskier proposition now than it was 2 years ago. So there's a limited supply of housing right now, inventory of housing, but there's huge demand for housing. Firms, builders are trying to keep up, but they're having trouble. And now now the high price of lumber is adding to their challenges. Spec housing might be really drying up here for the next couple of months until lumber prices come back down. So that will actually create more constraints and more demand for existing family homes. So that's just something to be watching for. That demographic trend is really, I think, a huge factor right now in the economy. Longer term, that's going to turn on us, probably. Longer term, Oregon, for example, has now a natural population decrease. So, aside from migration, Oregon's population would be falling now, and part of that is, of course, deaths are extra high this year because of the pandemic. Births are also extra low, possibly also because of the pandemic, right? So as we get to the next year, maybe we'll see some birth rates pick up, right? And we'll see the death rates lessen, but this is a long-term trend, right? And so this makes us more dependent upon migration from other states in order to support population growth and economic activity. And finally, I'll just say briefly, are we entering into a new period of rapid technological change? This is worth considering as a big upside potentially. This particular chart here is just an energy chart. Basically, the cost of batteries and the cost of renewable energies, right? The cost of renewable energies becomes less than the cost of traditional energies. That's a potentially game changer of adding a whole bunch of cheap energy to the economy, right? And the capacity for batteries to be cheaper and hold more really could have a major impact on electrifying our economy at a lower cost. So that's something to watch for. Work from home could be creating some really productivity advantages that we don't know about. Stress on labor markets is probably going to induce firms to look for more technology solutions or machinery solutions to their production processes. So this could create a large boost from improving productivity going forward. So that's just something that's sitting here on my radar. Also, so we measure that in productivity, so output per hours of all persons. And really the question is, can you sort of recreate what we did in the late 1990s and early part of the 2000s, where we had very high productivity growth, and that translates into very high wage growth, real wage growth after inflation. So will we sort of enter into the same story here? Whatever productivity increases we have right now are those are cyclical in the fact that we're just not hiring as many people as we'd want due to demand. And so that's kind of artificially boosting productivity. We won't really know until we get deeper into this recovery what productivity growth really is. But anyway, that's still out there. The other thing too is the technology that brought us the vaccines probably has some wide-ranging capabilities. There is rumors of or talk that Moderna actually has a cancer vaccines based on this technology, right? And so if you could reduce, if you could have a vaccine that knocked off, 10, just say 10 or 15% of the cancers, right? There's a whole industry, right? A whole medical industry. It's basically the basic proposition of that industry is that we're going to extend your life for 6 months in return for your life savings, right? That's the promise of that industry. And I don't mean to be callous, but I've just seen that too many times. That industry could go away overnight with just small advances, or what might be fairly small advances now in some of these technologies. So that's another interesting, I think, development that could occur going forward here. Right? Okay, so I've talked for probably 50 minutes now, and I probably want to open this up for questions at this point.
So, Tim, I was just curious. We talked a little bit about this before, but when you showed the transfer payments increase in such a monumental way in such a short period of time, what are the long-term implications of that? It's, I keep coming back to who's going to end up paying for all that and when.
Well, we don't know what the longer-term implications are. We don't know how much debt the economy can support, right? If there's a negative implication, it's that inflation is going to get much higher than anyone expects. I mean, it's not really ability to pay off the debt, right? It's going to be that inflation eats away at the real value of that debt, right? And I don't have a great story here. I'll be honest here. Japan has racked up debt after debt after debt for many years and never reached a point where they were able to really push forward inflation or have any sort of problems dealing with the debt. And they're kind of the poster child for this sort of thing. I don't think they've ever done anything like this, okay? I don't know that anyone has really done anything like this before. I don't even know if World War II is a comparable sort of blast of fiscal stimulus. So I personally think we should be humble about what's going to be the impacts here going on. The Washington policy community doesn't want to ask that question, right? Just doesn't want to ask that question. I don't think, and because that would suggest that all the policy of the last year was just wrong, or excessive, or misguided, not sufficiently targeted, right? And if you think back to last year, wasn't probably the wrong policy, right? We didn't know what was going on. Risks were high. Throwing a bunch of money in the economy and sort of hoping it falls into all the cracks, that's probably the right policy, right? Was that the right policy in January, though? That's not exactly clear yet. We'll know in the next year if inflation is persistently higher than we have. If we kick off a process where prices and wages are both rising at a faster pace, that we push the economy really past its capacity, that's going to be the signal that maybe we did too much. In which case, some of that's going to be eaten up in real terms by inflation, higher interest rates, and possibly higher taxes. Those are your stories. But I ask this question a lot, not as a sort of, oh my God, running around screaming with my head cut off, the world is going to end here sort of story. This is like the 1970s sort of story. I ask myself that, just, I feel like in the policy community right now, even asking this question is basically, is basically considered like just rude. And so, and that worries me. I don't actually know what the answer here is, but I don't like the fact that we're not talking about it.
Thank you, Tim. And we've got one question here in the Q&A to share with you, but I also wanted to let folks know our featured other viewers here we don't have a Q&A function for them or a question function. So I see Rich has a hand up, so I'll go to you, Rich, next. And well, I'll try to do that visually, but we do have one on the Q&A. Mike Fulgaro asked about your thoughts on asset bubbles.
Okay, so good question. Clearly, again, this gets to this unprecedented amount of fiscal policy. It's got to show up somewhere, right? In my opinion, it has to show up somewhere. It's got to have an impact somewhere in the economy. It's either going to be on, and it's going to be on prices. And it's going to be either consumer prices or asset prices. And I think a large portion of it is just starting to show up into consumer prices, and it has already been showing up into asset prices. Now, interestingly, I don't know if it's really traditional equities. I think that they might be frothy or a little expensive, but I don't think it's actually quite insane given the rebound in the economy. Where it might be showing up is cryptocurrencies, right? That pockets of froth, that sector of the economy that's kind of just made up is, I would say, definitely bubbly, if not straight up bubbles. So that's something I think is there. I think we see that in some of like, there's been some things like people have driven up the price of GameStop, a retailer, a computer game retailer. You've seen some bizarre behavior like that going on. I think that all screams to me asset bubble. Housing's tough. To me, that doesn't scream to me asset bubble, because I know that underwriting conditions are much stronger than we had in the last downturn, the last housing bubble, the actual bubble. So it's more real money based on real income driving that process. Also, I know that there's a big mismatch between supply and demand in the housing market right now. So I'm less convinced that that's a bubble or an asset price problem than I am on, sort of that crypto area. And I think that's a problem, perhaps, to the extent that that merges with traditional finance, and then there creates some more risk of systemic risk for the financial system, because we don't really know what those risks are because it's a brand new asset class, right? So that's where there's a lot of red flags for me going up. But that, I can't tell you, this is the thing about asset bubbles, is they're great. It's easy to say this is an asset bubble, but saying when it's going to have a consequence is a lot harder.
Thanks, Tim. So Rich, Duncan, and then Mayor Clark, we've got you on deck here.
Tim, thanks. It's always great to hear your insight. I being a commercial contractor, I'd love to see a graph that shows where the prices are going to level off. I'm seeing weekly now price increases, and they're quite substantial. And I would say that, even 2 years ago, 3 years ago, these price increases would have killed a project. They're that significant. And right now, seemingly the demand is saying, okay, well, we're going to accept that increase, right, that delay.
Right. And that is, a lot of people are just sucking up those costs right now, which is kind of almost a worrisome sign that people don't expect prices to go back down. So that's kind of almost a red flag, or they have so much money they don't care. I can't give you an answer to that question, right? Is that I don't know what's going on, say, in the lumber market entirely. I know what kicked off the supply and demand mismatch, right? Is that a bunch of mills were shut down last year for the pandemic. that didn't have the impact on housing that was expected. And then there's the issues that, well, the fires, et cetera, that slowed down production last year in Oregon and other parts of the country. So I know what triggered that mismatch, but it's kind of taken on a life of its own in the financial markets. And here, I don't think this is a popular opinion, but I'm a little bit worried that, again, this is one of those asset bubble sort of things, is that, how much of this, I know that there is some constraints in this market, how much of that is fueling some extra speculation that's exacerbating the pricing? And then how much is that bleeding into the real economy and the fact of, I'm pretty sure we're going to see housing start to slow down here. We're getting a lot of word from national level builders that, they're not going to be building on spec right now, or they're just putting off even contract buying, unless a buyer can really afford it. That might not be an Oregon issue because we don't have those large tracts of homes that you do in other places, right? So it could be here that Oregon buyers just accept the prices, 40 grand more amortized over 30 years sort of thing. But it's not like you can bump up production of timber overnight, right? And we're taking a lot of logs off these burned forests right now, but mill capacity is your issue. And you just don't build a mill for a temporary supply increase. There's a labor shortage. Not all these mills can get staffed up for the second or third shift. So a lot of problems going on that are providing, and this isn't just timber. You see this everywhere, right? I've heard that you might know this too, obviously, that plumbing, the PEX plumbing, right, is in short supply, right? Copper has gone through the roof, right? I've heard windows are having problems, right? So I've heard it across a wide range of building products. And this is, everybody is saying, these are short-term supply related bottlenecks, and they will get worked out in 6 months, right? And if that's the case, it's not a big deal. I mean, it's a 6 big deal. I think for a macroeconomic picture, it is what it is, right? Again, getting to the point, I think I'm not I'm not like this. I don't want to sort of fall into that. This is going to be the 1970s sort of thing. But it seems to me that people are just discounting the possibility a little bit too heavily that this is more of a persistent impact. But I hear your pain.
Mayor Clark, I think you're on next, and then Tim Murphy.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate the comments today. And I would agree with that last statement of this is persistent, knowing that Oregon is behind 30,000 housing units per year pre-pandemic. So I think you are correct. This is longer term for Oregon and how we've structured our housing. And that leads me to my question, which is the economic disparity that's been exacerbated by these rising housing costs. We've had the artificial constraints here in Oregon, plus the supply chain and the things you've just mentioned. And then on top of that, we've been pouring massive amounts of money into accounts of working people and who have been putting into savings. My kids were really smart. And if they were working, they paid off debt, and they paid it off quickly because they recognized that that was a good thing to do with money and a long-term benefit for them. But we had people who had short and mid-range or short-term, loss of jobs, and they needed every single penny and then some when they could finally get their unemployment. So what I'm concerned about is a widening of the economic disparity, and the universal application of funds is not making that better, but I think it's making it worse. How are we going to be able to look at the short and mid-range impact of the economic disparity that's been created by some of the policies that came out of Washington this year?
Right. So that's like a big topic all on its own. You're right. And I think it gets to the point, right, that I made earlier, is that early in the pandemic, it was great to throw lots of resources because you didn't know what was going on. So it's better to fill all the cracks, right? The second round, again, maybe should have been more targeted, right? Spending more targeted on individuals that were disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. Now, some things that could help those individuals going forward is actually running the labor market tight right now. What I think is happening is you're going to get a significant level shift up in wages. I think the $15 minimum wage debate is going to disappear simply because that's going to be the new norm. Chipotle said their norm minimum wage is going to be $15, right? So that's one thing that's going to kind of help alleviate some of the pressure on the economy. The housing situation's a mess. It's not getting any better. We need a massive step up in production, and we have too many constraints. We have constraints on the land side. We have constraint on the regulatory side. We have constraints on the labor side, the supply side, right? Everything is not lined up to create the kinds of housing at the scale that we need, right? Builders have only a certain amount of capacity, and they're smartly going to build to the high end of the market because that's where the most profit is. Right? That's just their incentive structure, and so there's nothing that's what you need to expect. The rest of the market is really what needs more assistance, and I don't know that it's easy to do that without large federal funds to support housing construction, or a regulatory environment that allows for much greater land use and much denser building styles. We already in Oregon, this is an old story. It's not like this is new, right? Urban growth boundaries. We filled up the urban growth boundaries with a lot of single family housing, right? Now there's a demand for densifying that housing, but it's very expensive and difficult to do, right? And so we don't necessarily do enough of it, right, to keep up with what's needed. There's no new story here, right? I've been telling this story for 10 years. Policymakers don't move fast enough on these things to resolve them, right? I mean, it's more of a blue state problem than a red state problem, right? If you could, the best solution I have right now is for us on a statewide basis to do something to support the infrastructure for builders so that they can actually build more cheaply, to reduce the pad costs, and start incentivizing them to overbuild a little bit. Builders, people forget that the last housing bubble, that was an anomaly. Builders generally don't build to depreciate their own product, right? They're not going to do that, right? They're not going to undermine their own profit margins if they know they're going to undermine their own profit margins. And so they're not going to naturally overbuild the market to really depress prices, right? You've got to sort of incentivize them to overbuild the market almost. And we're not doing that. We're, if you create additional taxes on building to support, you think you're doing a good thing by supporting, low income housing. It's not. It's raising the cost of housing generally. So, the thing that we need to do is make it cheaper to build, and we're really not doing that. But we are making it more expensive to build. So there's that.
I think one last question, Tim Murphy, you're going to close it up for us here with the questions.
Thank you. This was a terrific session. My question, I'm hoping to go back to the unemployment charts, really to discuss, is there any modeling that forecasts when we will unlock this workforce that is seemingly either tied to the taboo subject of not wanting to get off their couch for more than, for less than $23 an hour, because unemployment and stimulus checks ultimately are driving just a better career sitting at home, or the idea that the workforce is handcuffed at home due to childcare and the deficit of childcare in Oregon. we're a dental manufacturer in Newburgh. We've in the last year taken steps to expand our staffing reach, both from agencies. We've gone from 1 primary to 5 agencies, reaching further and farther away from our hub. And we're just not seeing any movement in what the charts you illustrated say that the rate is going down. I'm just wondering whether or not those charts are just aging people out that otherwise started on unemployment 18 months ago and therefore are no longer being counted. I'm just not seeing any movement.
Right. Okay. So the story, give you the story. The story is unemployment benefits expire at the end of September or beginning of September. Some states are moving to expire them at the end of June, right? That's still, I mean, it's not, you're talking about 16 weeks, right, on unemployment. So if that's a problem, that's going to start to alleviate itself this summer, right? As people wind off of unemployment. So that's one thing. Second thing is that you're right. The idea story is that by this fall, we have open schools, and then that will help alleviate some of the childcare issues, right? So we are hoping that over the next 6 months, a lot of the supply constraints are relieved. Now, that does not account for the possibility of people being resistant to re-enter the workforce because of ongoing, what I call post-traumatic stress disorder, right? Over the COVID pandemic. And I think that's perfectly reasonable. A lot of people have suffered from enormous amounts of stress over the past year and are going to be wary. This particularly for older workers, right? They're going to be wary to return to work. So this could be a much more of a persistent problem than people recognize. There's also possibly an increase in reservation wages that will be persistent after this, which means people will resist taking jobs that don't pay, $23 an hour. And so that's something that we might have sort of changed the structure of the economy. What people forget is we were starting to have these problems in 2018, 2019, right? Labor markets were super tight there. We were just on the bleeding edge of some real constraints in labor markets where that got suddenly changed on us. Now I'd say demand is actually higher than it was in that period, but the labor supply is even more constrained, right? So, I think restaurants, are under particular stress right now. Again, they were under stress in 2018, 2019. Their models were really being challenged because their labor was already churning so heavily. So, another year of 2018, 2019 might have pushed us over the edge already into another year. And that's what we're just getting to now. So I don't know that your labor supply is going to ease up anytime soon. Because if you've been struggling this long, the demand for labor has only gone up over that period of time. So that's going to be problematic for you. So then you have to decide, are these things you can automate away? Those stories start to become more relevant, but some tasks you can't automate away. And I know this is not the story anybody wants to be telling right now. Also, there's been an uptick in labor force participation among teen workers, 16 to 19. So this might be opportunities to start training up the younger workforce and getting them sort of out of necessarily a college-bound direction and into a technical skills direction, which I think would be important for the economy because you can't get somebody to swing a hammer for the life of you. Right. My wife inquired about getting our deck extended, so I'm not just sitting on this little portion off the. And they said, "Well, that's great. We'd love to work with you, but nobody's swinging a hammer at your place till September." And that's just just labor supply constraints across various sectors of the economy. Restaurants get a lot of press right now, but I know that it's not there. It's not just there. It's everywhere.
On that note, Tim, good luck with the deck, first of all. And thank you very much for sharing all the data and the trends with us. I know we're always very appreciative of having, you come on board with us. And thank you also to the University of Oregon for giving you the ability to come and check in with us on a regular basis. So greatly appreciate that.
My pleasure.
I will save my question about Dogecoin for later. I was hoping you could explain that to me.
I can't explain that. I can't explain assets that are jokes, but then become worth billions of dollars. I can't process that.
So thank you everybody for tuning in. I appreciate that. It is actually nicer to see a lot of friendly faces participating here, so I can understand Tim's desire for that. So thank you all for being part of this. Thank you for the folks that are out there logging on to us. Once again, keep checking our webpage for our events page, because we do have some things coming up for through the summer on there. We do have our Business and Industry Resource Alliance event coming up featuring Tim Murphy from DCI, hopefully sharing some of his thoughts and information that building on what he said earlier too, as one of our panelists. That's coming up on May 25th at 2 p.m. And also, please keep the golf tournament ideas coming. We've actually already had a couple come in, so thanks to Melissa Rogers and Dean Craig for their ideas. I think with that, we will look forward to hopefully seeing you on June 9th for our next forum on building a stronger workforce, another apt title, working with the Willamette Promise and the Willamette School District. Having said that, go out, hopefully you can enjoy some sunshine and some fresh air. It's going to be a nice few days. So thanks everybody for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you soon.